make a transition.
All right.
Why do I have to swallow this Christian God? Because this now is much really where I want to get. Okay, you've convinced me there's a God.
All right.
All right, and so some of the other arguments from God we'll not go into right now, the ontological, but the Christian God.
Right. What I've said so far is consistent with a sort of generic monotheism that Jews and Christians and Muslims would all be happy to affirm, that there is a creator and designer of the cosmos who is the source and locus of absolute moral value. Now the question is, which of these monotheisms is true, if any? And what I would argue is that God has revealed himself decisively in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, who claimed to be the Son of God and the absolute revelation of God, and whose radical personal claims were publicly vindicated by God by raising him from the dead.
So you're going to run right to the resurrection?
Yes.
Okay. So the resurrection, Paul had a point when he said, and so should you, all right? But Paul said, look, if the resurrection didn't happen, we above all men are to be pitied, we above all men are fools. So the resurrection event. Let's. I know you have a slide in case we got here. So let's walk through what you think are the best arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. Because if the resurrection event happened, it does seem to set him apart.
Oh, it does, clearly. All right. As a result of my doctoral work on the historicity of the resurrection in Munich, I discovered that there are 4 facts which are acknowledged by the wide majority of New Testament historians today. And I want to emphasize this. It's not just evangelical or conservative scholars that recognize these facts. This is the broad mainstream view of New Testament criticism today. And these facts are, number 1, that Jesus was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea, that this tomb was then discovered empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, that thereafter various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead, and fourthly, that the origin of the Christian faith owes its existence to the belief of these early disciples that God had raised Jesus from the dead, a belief that they came to share sincerely and suddenly despite every predisposition to the contrary. And so the fact is, how do you best explain these facts? And I would...
All right, let me just interject here, because my question is this. So you're saying the historicity of that event is not a live discussion?
Well, it's a live discussion. I don't want to say this is unanimous, but what I said is that it is the majority view by far.
And what would you say about this event in antiquity and how it compares to other things that nobody has any issue with, whether or not they believe with Luther in the 1600s, or taking it back further to the Caesars in BC Rome, that they existed, and the Acts of Mark Antony and all that?
Well, it's difficult to compare totally different events in terms of their evidential attestation. But N.T. Wright, a very prominent New Testament historian, in his book on the resurrection of Jesus, after about 700 pages of discussion, he says that in his professional opinion, the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearances of Jesus are so well attested as to be virtually undeniable, and are comparable to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 or the reign of Augustus Caesar. This is just astonishing that the evidence for the resurrection would be comparable to indisputable events like these.
So somebody that says that the only reliable testament to that is the New Testament, that would not be an informed position?
Well, it's not that it's an uninformed position, it's that it is based upon a false presupposition, and that is that the New Testament documents somehow shouldn't count as historically reliable documents. And that's simply a false presupposition. When New Testament scholars look at the New Testament, they aren't treating it as a wholly inspired book. They're treating it as what it originally was, just a bunch of separate documents, letters, biographies, and so forth, written in the Greek language, handed down out of the first century, telling this remarkable story about Jesus of Nazareth. And we have far more historical information about Jesus of Nazareth than we do for most major figures of antiquity.
Yep, that is key, because I think that's where folks go. They go, well, you can't believe those guys because they're part of the conspiracy.
Right.
Okay.
That's uninformed.
It is uninformed.
Yeah.
And give me your best 15 seconds on why that's uninformed.
Well, this used to be held back in the late 18th century among certain English deists and German rationalists. And basically, it was exploded and rejected universally by scholars since then for a couple of reasons. One is that it is anachronistic. It reads the disciples' situation through the rear-view mirror of Christian history, thinking that they would fake a resurrection so that Jesus could be the Messiah, rather than putting yourself in the shoes of these disciples themselves. When you do that and look at what they faced from a perspective of a first-century Jew, the crucifixion was a disaster for these men, because Messiah was supposed to throw off the enemies of Israel and establish David's throne in Jerusalem, not be humiliatingly executed by his enemies. Moreover, there was no connection between being the Messiah and being raised from the dead. The resurrection was a Jewish hope that would take place at the end of the world, not of an isolated individual in history. So the idea of a conspiracy is simply a failure to understand the mentality of a first-century Palestinian Jew. That would be one problem. The other problem is that there's no doubting, when you read the New Testament, the sincerity of these men and women. They were ready to die for the truth.
And did.
And many of them did die. And so you cannot say that this was the result of some sort of a deliberate hoax or conspiracy. There's no doubt when you read the pages of the New Testament, these people really believed this message.
So go forward, and the best explanation for the reason that these guys really believed it is because...
Right. I think the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, which was their explanation, the one the eyewitnesses gave, is the best explanation. And what I would do here is compare the resurrection hypothesis with alternative hypotheses, like the conspiracy hypothesis, the wrong tomb hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and you would assess these hypotheses using the standard criteria that historians use. And I think what you'll find is that the resurrection hypothesis has greater explanatory power, wider explanatory scope, greater plausibility, it's less ad hoc or contrived, and so on and so forth, and so emerges as the best explanation.
Okay, wonderful. Anything else in the resurrection that you throw out?
Just as I point out in premise 3, the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead entails that the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists, from which it follows that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists. That is to say, the true God is the God revealed and proclaimed by Jesus of Nazareth.